right. Hello, everybody. I see there's more of you sitting. Great. There's more room up here. As Jennifer said, she's not using projection, so this is something where you really want to be able to listen closely. We are beginning the low-res summer by starting on time, so thank you so much, everyone, for being here, for being on time. And I'm really excited to kick off our summer session, our series of the many incredible thinkers and makers who are going to be coming through low-res this summer, and to begin with something that we have never done before, which is have our first inaugural Theorist-in Community. Before I do that, though, I'll introduce myself. I'm sure most of you know me, but I'm Eliza Schwartz. I'm the director of low-res, and I'm going to start in low-res fashion by reading a poem, which, as we know, is a practice we have in low-res as a moment of secular attunement, and a moment for us to arrive in the room together. So, here we go. This is a poem called Trauma is Not Sacred by Kai Cheng Thom. Violence is not special, pain is not holy suffering, does not make angels, abuse defines no one. You are more than the things that hurt you. You are more than the people you have hurt. Do not make an altar to your woundedness. Do not make a fetish out of mine. A body belongs to no one. One memory is not made to be eaten. Does it titillate you to hear about assault if I told you my story? Would you swallow it whole if I confessed my sins? Would you feed me to the beasts to purge your own? I will show you mine if you show me yours. We have all seen the darkness. Now give us the dawn. Tell me about the joy you keep in your hollow spaces between your bones. Tell me again about how you laughed when you realized that you were not wholly unlovable. I'll tell you again how I cried when my best friend told me that I was not a bad person. Remember how we used to count the lines on our palms when we were little, how we used to try to read the future for its gifts, how we used to make lists of the things we would dream of when finally we were free. I will make you a list of the things I'm grateful for. I will sing you a litany of reasons to be alive. I want to know the songs you wake up for in the morning. I want to marvel at the unbelievable graciousness of your being. I know that I am capable of pouring love like lavender oil into your cupped palms. There is forgiveness like honey pooled in the chambers of our hearts. You are the thing I am most grateful for. All bodies know how to heal themselves given enough time. All demons carry a map of heaven and their scars beneath the skin of every history of trauma. There is a love poem waiting deep below. It's a bit of a mouthful. And now I'm really thrilled to introduce our Theorist-in Community, Jennifer Doyle. The Theorist-in Community for low-res is, again, a new position, a new speaker that we invite to have us think together, to help us think through this question that I think animates low-res more than any other program, because we are, as the title describes, a low residency program, which is how do we come together? How do we be together? And I'm very excited that we'll be hearing today from Jennifer Doyle, whose work has really delved deeply into the question of how we be together, how we come together through difficulty, because of difficulty, in difficulty. This question of how difficulty can animate a sense of collectivity, a politics, an aesthetics, and a community has been, I think, in many ways, the foreground of what I've admired so much about Jennifer Doyle's work, what her work has catalyzed in me, and the way that she's shown me a pathway into what an intellectual and creative community can look like. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jennifer Doyle. Jennifer Doyle is the author of Campus Sex, Campus Security, Hold It Against Me, Difficulty and Emotion in Contemporary Art. Sorry, hold this all one title. Hold It Against Me, Difficulty and Emotion in Contemporary Art, and Sex Objects, Art and the Dialectics of Desire. With Jeanne Vaccaro, she is co-curator of Scientia Sexualis, a group exhibition opening in October at ICA LA. She is president of the board of directors at Human Resources Los Angeles and a professor of English at UC Riverside. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Jennifer Doyle, our first Theorist-in Community.
Oh my God, I have the tingles. It's really meaningful to be introduced by an artist whose work I really admire and which in part inspired Hold It Against Me. So that's like very meaningful to me. So I'm reading from a new book that'll be out in October, and the book is called Shadow of My Shadow, and it gathers about 10 years of writing that is a response to the experience of harassment, and that comes from two different places. One is from personal experience, and one is actually from my work in sports studies, where the sexual abuse of athletes is so endemic in sports, and as I started to work on sports, it was something that was really kind of tripping me up because I didn't feel like I could move forward with a book about sports and art, which is where I'll probably be going next in my writing, but without addressing that. So the book, I'm not reading from this here because it's actually one of the driest chapters in the book, weirdly, but it's a forensic kind of analysis of a Title IX report that cleared Larry Nassar, who was the person who abused hundreds of gymnasts and other athletes while he's working for USA Gymnastics and MSU, Michigan State University. And I just mentioned that just because it's the work of people like Amanda Thomashaw who filed that complaint that has really helped to transform the culture around sexual harassment. So it's a lot of people who have filed a lot of complaints and grievances over many years that have been ignored or gone bad, that have contributed to significant shifts in our everyday life. So in a lot of ways, this book is my own kind of record of my participation in that process, I guess, as a scholar. I just wanted to say that. I'm going to jump around. I tried to pull out the driest stuff in the book, and you're going to understand why there is dry writing in the book. I'm going to explain that in the reading. And so sometimes the shifts will be abrupt, and I may just stop myself. Sorry, I'm just pulling out my clock so I can start a timer so I have a sense of how long I've been talking. And that might be awkward because I can't make my phone just do that. So I guess that's timer, right? Yeah, start. Oh, whoops, sorry. Timer is what I use to bake things. Stopwatch is what I want. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to start with the opening paragraphs of the book. Oh, by the way, I have watched Baby Reindeer, and I'm happy to talk about it with anyone. If all you knew about stalking was what you learned from Law & Order, Dirty John, or Snapped, you would think that most victims are terrified that they will be killed. There's a strong relationship between stalking and violence. Murder victims are often stalked before the big event, but this is not what keeps the victim up at night. When asked to describe what most haunts them, victims lead not with the fear that they will be hurt. They lead with anxiety of not knowing what is going to happen. Right behind that is the fear that it will never end. These are the contradictions these are the conditions of being afraid of life. Victims describe the experience of having reformatted their sense of self. This was certainly true for me. I was stalked by a student. At work, I was caught in the maw of campus procedure. The unnerving forms of fear, anxiety, and distrust that define the experience of being stalked migrated into my workplace. What happened was painful and bizarre, and it disturbed my relationship to teaching, writing, and mentoring. I've tried to find ways to restore my relationship to my job, and then I struggled to accept that in some very important ways that damage is permanent. My writing became the scene of a compound form of violation. When I look back on this time, I think of a rape narrative cliche, the shower scene in which the victim scrubs and scrubs as if she were trying to shed her skin. I used to find those scenes ridiculous because they're so often repeated, but then I caught myself doing my own version of it, scrubbing my writing of the personal voice that otherwise characterized my work. I do this most when I'm writing from the place, of course I lose my place when I'm trying to say that, right? I do this most when I'm writing from the place that was violated by what happened. Although personal experience led me to research subjects like harassment and paranoia, when I first wrote about these things, I withdrew from the page. I worked at erasing my tracks, adopting a depersonalized voice that was me and not me. This is why I've made liberal use of the first person in what I've shared so far. I'm drawing that person back onto the page. When I write about this sphere of experience, I confront things that are particular to the situation of the harassed. A creepy energy clings to victims. It is hard to write about harassment without drawing from the economies of sensation that amplify its debilitating effects. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to share this in a room full of artists, because I know when people are making work about things like this, you know what that's like, right? So I've already done this. The opening paragraphs of this book play to the inherent interest of the stalking narrative. Before we continue, let me dial it back. This person stopped harassing me years ago, and being stalked isn't the worst thing that's happened in my life. If murder victims are often stalked, stalking victims are rarely murdered. On college campuses, most stalking cases, most stalking behavior towards teachers is fleeting, lasting just a few weeks or months. People go through far worse than what I experienced. The fact that this person was a student and not a former partner, for example, mitigated the invasiveness of the experience for me. And the person who stalked me is not my enemy. If there is a Gothic dimension to the story of what happened to me, it resides not in the figure of a monster, but in the paranoid environment of a large, deeply hierarchical institution like my university. Shadow of my shadow describes what we lose when harassment ecologies consume us. Each chapter was carved from the cluster of problems generated by sexualized forms of harassment and bias, and by the situation of writing from my experience and about my own case. In writing this, I have needed to confront my anger and interrogate my aims. For example, when I write as a victim of harassment, I am tempted to present myself as an aggrieved maverick pursuing a tough line of inquiry. I plead my case and ride a wave of self-righteous anger for an hour or two, and then I am beached. While a sense of grievance might be initiated by an actual wrong, it might also be sustained by a sense of entitlement. In that voice, I reconstruct the scene of my betrayal and lament the world that I was promised and denied. My modes of address are all off. I'm not writing for a reader, but for the person who refuses to listen, who abandons my case and turns their back on me. I cannot sustain that voice, and so I abandon ship. I come back, sift through the wreckage, plucking out the sentences that argue, plead, and complain. They are sour bubbles of grievance. Those forms of grievance characterize the most visible writing on sexual harassment in Title IX. Stories about feminists accused of harassment, women accused by men, professors lamenting student hysteria, cries of censorship. Popular, widely read articles about specific cases can be characterized by devastating forms of carelessness. This writing thrives on melodramas of uncertainty, he said, she said, and responds to harassment cases with a scramble for the nearest moral high ground. It is not supported by investigation, research, or even fact-checking. And I have a footnote there, and I'm just going to speak that footnote out loud. Laura Kipnis's Unwanted Advances, which was a New York Times bestseller, widely reviewed in academic context, and no one fact-checked any of the citations of the case. And if you can see me boiling with rage, it's because she digests a case in my own department and spoke only to the abuser who was actually fired. Right, so I'm angry. Right, so behind the discourse of harassment, by which I mean the narrative frameworks that shape the experience of and ideas about harassment, are assumptions about the relationship of sex and truth. These assumptions normalize the sense that when it comes to sex, nothing is knowable, and at the same time, they laminate the truth of sex to the obscene. Within these structures, sex, quote, appears as an especially dense transfer point of relationships of power. I have no idea who that's from because it's footnoted, but I think it's Foucault, maybe Sedgwick. It is simultaneously invested with the force of the unspeakable and rendered into a privileged site for heroic truth-telling. This contradiction is weaponized within a harassment ecology. In those instances, victims are positioned as against sex. They are characterized as prudes and hysterics, as overly fragile, or more brutally, as liars. The uncertainties and contradictions that haunt the reception of stories of harassment are the effects of harassment. Harassment's intensities can make it feel like the truth is not only unknowable but irrelevant. This does not mean that the identity of harassment's agents and objects is beyond knowing and saying, but that truth is sometimes disavowed by people who harass and by an abuser's community. Some people, furthermore, are driven to harass because they feel persecuted and harassed by others. It may be that nothing you say will convince them that the person they are harassing or the system isn't out to get them. Harassment is intimate and intensely social. The truth of a harassment case nests in the platforms through which that case emerged. For example, the campus, the family, the workplace. Harassment is a non-consensual form of relation in which a whole scene collaborates. A focus on, I think that was I wanted to stop there, right? Okay, yeah. Sorry, that's that awkward jump that I promised you. Okay. So, and I have these moments in the book where I slip into this kind of declarative statements about harassment and paranoia. So I'm going to shift to, this is a chapter that's called A Case of Paranoia. And that chapter actually revolves around a very close reading or unfolding of a short essay by Sigmund Freud called The Case of Paranoia Running Counter to the Theory. And we'll be talking about that case in the seminar. I'm sharing the writing that happens in this chapter around that case, so I'm not going to do a dive into the Freud, but I'm going to talk about harassment. Paranoia and its harassment and complaints and grievances. So paranoia has an endless appetite. Some things about paranoia. It is a style of thought, organized, systemic, binarized, projective, a set of feelings, persecutory, excited, frustrated, angry, a position, defensive, a mood, manic, pessimistic, aggressive, dark, and a clinical term describing a set of psychological struggles. Paranoia can characterize a person or a group's relationship to the world. In fact, some have argued that groups are particularly good at paranoia. We are most familiar with its manifestations as a spiraling sensitivity to humiliation and insult that can carry increasing densities of meaning. These insults can assemble into persecutory delusions that range in scale and intensity from a nagging insecurity, my boss doesn't really like me, to an epic struggle with the cosmos. Bill Gates is reading my mind. Paranoid postures and thought systems are defensive phenomena that anticipate catastrophe, warding off disaster with an ever more intricate narratives about enemies and their motives and fantasies of conspiracy and surveillance. They serve important purposes in our lives, emerging out of a fundamental need to identify vectors of harm, but can lock people into a debilitating anxiety and/or state, a state from which they inflict harm on people around them, whom they experience as threats and enemies. Paranoia, as Sylvan Tompkins writes, is defined by, quote, a strong theory of negative affect, end quote. Fully activated, paranoia will mobilize a powerful interpretive apparatus behind its defense against hurt and humiliation. It can be so dedicated to the work of anticipating disaster, however, that it leaves no room for positive affect or feeling. The latter becomes, quote, a luxury the paranoid cannot afford while he is engaged in welfare, end quote. That is a paraphrasing of a whole bunch of theorists writing about paranoia. And I continue. Paranoia has formal properties. Paranoid thinking is mesmerizing, beautiful. It is patterned, mirrored, fractal, viral, spiraled, escalatory. Melanie Klein approached paranoia as a specific form of anxiety, a set of persecutory fears that yield a splitting of the world into good and bad objects. The term schizoid describes the splitting, cleavings, and fragmentations that proliferate in paranoid systems. For Klein, the paranoid schizoid position emerges quite early as a part of normative infant development. The child experiences the caretaker's body as part objects and are furthermore split into objects of love and hate, thus the good breast and the bad breast. You may have heard that. In her model, psychosis grows out of crises in the working through of frustration, fear, and anger at this level, in which the splitting necessary to the practice of living, meaning recognizing that which is good, that which is bad, that which is nourishing, that which is toxic, right? That splitting develops into extremes of idealization and hatred and the adoption of binarized, warlike postures. A frustrated desire may be projected and rewritten as a sense of persecution that demands destruction of the other. This person doesn't give me what I want. This person is bent on destroying me. I must destroy them before they destroy me. The paranoid subject might project the most loved and hated aspects of their own self onto two people in their world, who then orbit each other. I must protect A from the machinations of B. A is honest and trustworthy. B is a malicious fake. These are just a few expressions of the splitting or schizoid tendencies that define relatively everyday paranoid postures. And so that writing actually comes immediately after a chapter in which I recite my case. And so all of that is like all over that narrative, right? So, and I'm going to talk about that case right now, so hold on a second. Right, that's usually the part that people want. That's my baby reindeer moment. In the beginning, and I call this person N, and I just use that initial for name, because I don't want to name her. In the beginning, her story was simple. My role as a teacher prohibited me from expressing my true feelings. Then, as the school prohibited her from contacting me, actually existing institutional structures seemed to affirm that narrative. This also seemed to intensify her sense of persecution. The forces that required the encoding of our relationship grew in scale, and my own place in the story mutated. And I'm just going to pause to say, like, the low point in the story of that case at school was that the school insisted on having a student conduct hearing in order to expel her. And I refused, for a lot of reasons, I refused to participate in that, and so I wasn't there. The committee that heard that case, there was like a senior male faculty member on it who didn't believe in harassment and who encouraged her to narrate her psychotic delusion and her attachment to me, and so the hearing went on for 7 hours. And most of that discussion, which I've heard through an audio recording, was about my sex life, which was deduced from my work. And then she was found innocent of stalking me. That's after they watched they secretly recorded video and listened to secretly recorded audio of me. So, ha ha ha. So it was pretty bad. It was really a long time ago, though. So it's just when I tell this story, I'm like, oh yeah, that's bad, because you function, you have to, you kind of like let it go because it was like so long ago, and so people have been through worse. But oh my God, that was bad, right? So, but I referenced the hearing in this anecdote, which is why I share that. So in this conduct hearing, N described me as, quote, engaged in over-the-top conversations regarding sex and related subjects, end quote. She described us as in a relationship, the evidence for which was my work. She accused me of retaliating against her by engineering my own stalking. She said that I wrote the emails, I sent the flowers, I was posting comments on my blog, and so on. She claimed it was all me. She presented me as a repressed lesbian who was jealous of N and her partner because they had a baby. She told the student conduct committee that would eventually clear her that I had been vindictive after she critiqued an essay I published on abortion. Hi. Actually, I forgot. There's actually a little intersection there on the bibliographic level. She used the fact that I'd had an abortion, which was mentioned in that essay briefly, and I think it's even in a footnote, to shore up this story about my jealousy. She told colleagues that shortly after the birth of their child, I'd reported N to social services. So you can imagine what colleagues thought of me. I was, in this story, intent on destroying her family because she had what I wanted. I did not do those things, but there's a reason why my writing on abortion featured in her defense against the accusation that she was harassing me. I think of a specific time in my life as the primary context for her stalking behavior. The 2-year period when I met, this is like there's a whole story about a romantic relationship that I had with someone I used the letter S for him. So this is a 2-year period when I met S, fell in love, and grieved our relationship, and it's also the same period during which Eve Sedgwick, who was my teacher, died. When S and I met, I was writing about abortion. Early in our relationship, when he asked me about my work, we talked about this. We shared our feelings about reproduction and sexuality, and early in our relationship, I told him an anecdote about sitting at a table with a bunch of friends who were talking about wanting to have children. I interrupted the evening's amiable flow with a story of the abortion I had during my first semester at college. I made the experience into a picaresque, happy adventure. My anecdote was honest, but deliberately oppositional and even aggressive. When S and I talked about that evening and my bad behavior, because I was embarrassed that I couldn't just keep quiet and let people enjoy their own sense of their future, S had said that he wished he had access to a rhetorical intervention like that, which might allow him to neatly describe, performatively enact, his own relationship to these forms of compulsory reproductive heterosexuality. I had never heard a straight man say that. It was an unguarded statement about his experience of gender and difference. It moved me, and it helped me to understand the discourse of abortion in an expanded sense. It helped me to appreciate the specific position of the reproductive body as always already a figure for abortion. The body ascribed with the potential to become pregnant is loaded with abortive possibility, with the power to refuse possibility, and this for him was enviable. He coveted this kind of refusal. I got the sense that he found it sexy. I could see that in the conversation that I described to him, I was aborting, spinning the tale out, making it funny, gross, and weird. I'd thrown myself out of the circle with a lighthearted story about this thing that's supposed to be not only unfunny, but traumatic. Even now, so many years later, when I think about talking with S, I feel the pleasure of those conversations and I miss him. In those conversations, we felt each other. And right now, here, I am being the scholar that N described, atypical as an academic, and from certain perspectives, even extremely so. I am being over the top in conversations about sex and related subjects. I published my essay on abortion and queer theory in the journal Qui Parle. This is the essay that N had mentioned in the hearing. I'm going to take a pause because it's a dramatic moment. When I first turned to the campus for help, the staff handling harassment complaints told me that I needed to prove that the anonymous emails and unwanted gifts that were directed at my personal email account and sent to my home address were related to my job. Otherwise, this harassment was not the school's problem. I learned about a service that works like certified mail, identifying the IP address and general location, meaning city, county, and state, for the computer used by anyone who reads email messages that are sent through its platform. Talk about paranoia, just like knowing that exists. It's like, around this time, N had emailed me from her school account to ask me to send her a copy of my essay, which I had thought was weird because it's easily accessible through databases to which she had access. But I sent the article back to her as a reply, and I then sent a message replying to one of the anonymous, creepy emails that I had been sent. I sent both emails through this platform and shared what I learned with the campus. Given their IP addresses, the emails were likely from the same person and were sent from California. That was to eliminate my ex, who lives in Europe. I gave our Title IX investigator copies of that report, and when N was interviewed as a part of the Title IX investigation, the campus shared this material with N. So she was told that I'd use this platform to establish a link between N and the anonymous accounts. I used my writing on abortion as a lure, and N knew it. Looking back and knowing what I know now, I wish I had not done that. Okay, that's also part of the narrative, because I keep imagining that I had all this knowledge, which I certainly didn't at that time. It felt as if within the institution's structure and systems, N and I were two sides of a coin. The campus's complaint systems threw me into a Gothic space in which N's pathology was cast across the entire institution. It startled me. Her crisis seemed to harmonize with the university's processes and systems. One thing seemed to amplify the other. They patterned my life. She couldn't see the differences between us. The world radiated her desires back to her as if they were mine. And the school couldn't see the difference between either of us. Her behavior, my responses to it, and the administrative processes managing the crisis that grew around me were so in tune with each other that it felt like at work my job was to stay in that space of insecurity and fear. It felt as if in my work environment my job was to absorb and to live harassment. This crisis seemed to draw out a madness in the institution itself, and it's why I wrote Campus Sex, Campus Security, in which I don't talk about my case. At a particularly desperate moment, I came across an article on risk management and the stalking situation, and I tend to share it because it's kind of important should you ever kind of have this going on in your workplace. Its 6 authors approach stalking as a, quote, social problem, often driven by a psychiatric disorder in its perpetrators and productive of psychological and social damages in its victims, end quote. Addressing readers likely to find themselves managing stalking and harassing dynamics in and through a workplace or a school, they insist that stalking cases not be framed as conflict in which parties are understood as having opposed interests. Doing so enlists the institution in the stalking dynamic, and they explain. There is a conflict between the stalker's desires and the victim's interests, but they are one in being at risk of damage from the stalking situation. There can be a tragic symmetry between the victim forced to live an increasingly restricted life in a state of constant fear and the stalker's devoting all his or her time and resources to a futile and ultimately frustrating pursuit. Both the victim and the perpetrator's lives can be laid in waste. This is not to argue for an equivalence between victim and perpetrator. When stalking, there are real victims and real perpetrators. One offends, the other is offended against. However, they share a chance of disaster. The difficulty of the stalking situation grows from that entanglement of the living situations for the aggressor and the victim. The relationship is an intensely non-consensual form of social relation, and I went through long stretches of time in which my movements in the world were limited by fear. I could not, for example, walk from my car to my office without anxiety. I dreaded all forms of visibility. I knew enough about my stalker, however, to feel pretty sure of the following. As much as my own life felt increasingly constricted by her harassment of me, she was suffering too, if differently. And I should say, as I haven't shared before, that I worked with this graduate student for years before she started stalking me. So she wasn't like unknown to me. And it wasn't like I wasn't invested in her well-being. I felt like something was hovering over me, something frightening that others saw and that I could only sense by tracking their reactions to me. I felt haunted and burdensome. Over time, the things that gave me pleasure drifted away. The darkness that was hovering over me settled onto me and into me, and as it absorbed me, I lost my form. I turned to writing on paranoia because I was trying to understand what I was going through, not only as the object of another person's delusion, but as someone who was being driven to paranoia by workplace betrayals that pivoted on a story about me as a sexual person and as a figure, not just within the institution, but for it and of it. When you start working on harassment, and I think this is also intensely gendered, you become like a figure of of every problem that clings to harassment. It's really awful. It shows that awfulness to a certain degree by working on this. So I was struggling with the fact that so much of what had happened in my case, right, was between women, me and the students who helped her. It was all women students, and the women who administered the case, because of course this kind of labor in an institution falls on women. It mattered to me that we all handled things so badly. Over years, I turned to colleagues looking for help or even some kind of understanding, but I could feel their unease at the baggy weirdness of my story. When I talk about these things at work, it's still true. I'm not my best self. When I look at the archive of my emails to student conduct staff, to various deans, my department chair, chief campus counsel, I feel horrified by who I became as I moved through that procedural gauntlet. My emails grew more and more unwieldy. I explained, demonstrated, argued, begged, and lamented. My literary output reached its zenith in a very long email written after the hearing that outlined what had happened and how it was impacting me. I pointed to those aspects of Title IX and anti-discrimination law that addressed what I was going through, and I dared to offer brief summaries of the best practices for managing workplace harassment. And some of those paragraphs are actually in the book. So I tried to explain why that hearing was damaging. I tried to make it be useful. I can laugh at it now, but what on earth did I think that those tracts would accomplish? What did I imagine any of these people would do? I can't believe anyone actually read any of those emails, and I'm quite sure no one did, right? And I don't blame them. I was filing complaints, carrying grievances, and struggling to hold on to the parts of myself that were not defined by harassment. I was sitting in offices talking to people who thought I was crazy, and I felt crazy. It wasn't sustainable. Even now, so many years later, even with some distance on the crisis, I'm startled by how quickly anger wells up in me, especially at work, and you saw that when I mentioned the Kipnis book. Sarah Ahmed has described the complaint as a phenomenology of the institution. Truer words never been said. A case of harassment is a story about the relationship between the detail, the individual, and the structure in and through which harassment is staged. It requires theorization. You find yourself wrestling with the relationship between the system and the things that are happening to you, which feel personal and cling to your body. Patriarchy, capitalism, neoliberalism, white supremacy, the administration, these figures march across your case, rendering the exceptional thing you are enduring into something symptomatic and inevitable. To learn to live with the case is to learn how to ride out paranoia's highs. It's all related, and its lows, I'm doomed. sorry, I was just, this is a part where I was like, do I read this? Yeah. Yeah, so actually, no, I'm not going to read that. I'm going to skip ahead, again, awkwardly. So I'm going to conclude by reading a bit from the conclusion of the book. And the conclusion of the book was written in response to a feeling I'd had about something that was said about Eve Sedgwick, who figures in the book kind of throughout. When she died, there was people would use a line from her book, Dialogue on Love, which is a poem staged around her relationship to her therapist. And in that poem, she says, she fantasized about what people will say about her after she dies. And she confesses to her therapist that what she most wants is for people to, she says, like, what I'm proudest of, I guess, is having lived a life where it's impossible to tell work and love apart from each other, right? So, and I reacted to that line when I first read it in the book, and as I've seen it quoted in all kinds of different contexts, with a little bit of like, oh, you know, that sounds like a luxury I can't afford. And then I started to pressure that, like, why, right? And I have to say, I'm looking over at you because actually it was an insight around your own work, because I would hear people describe that student piece around abortion, that was like a privileged project, you know, that was like kind of a bratty project. And then, you know, and it's like this kind of sense where you've internalized an ideology that is taking something that should be a basic right and turning it into a luxury you can't afford, right? I could hear that pattern of thinking happening around this line of Sedgwick. So I went to Duke and to the library there, which has Eve's papers, and they had 2 years ago, they opened up her archive. And so I went and spent time with Eve's papers, and sorry, I want to read so much to you, right? So I wanted to write about her relationship to her work. And so I'm gonna close by sharing some writing about that. So it took Eve Sedgwick a decade to land something we'd call security of employment in the form of a full-time tenured position in a welcoming department, 10 years. She writes about that hire in a letter to her brother. She applied to work at Amherst College 3 times. The first time she interviewed there, she met Liz Bruss. Bruss had been hired by Amherst College's English department in 1972, a few years before the college began admitting women students. The first woman hired into a tenure-track position in that department, she was what Amherst calls a pioneering woman, a member of the generation that desegregated the college's all-male faculty. Eve didn't see Bruss at the final round of the on-campus interviews. I heard later, she tells her brother, that she had just had a miscarriage, her second, and that she was sick and depressed. Eve applied a second time for a 1-year visiting position as a poet. She wasn't hired, but she was a finalist for that search and visited the campus for the last round of interviews. In conversation with faculty there, she learned that Bruss was pregnant again, thanks to a hormone treatment, which might allow her to carry that baby to term. When she saw Bruss, quote, Liz was looking extremely lovely and happy. Bruss died very suddenly that year. She had been 8 months into her pregnancy when, quote, in the space of a couple hours, some tumor or something in her endocrine system, this is a quote from the letter, whose existence nobody had ever suspected and which may or may not have been aggravated by the hormones or the pregnancy, but who knows, just suddenly killed her, end quote. The department appealed to their dean to run a search to replace Bruss. They advertised for a position in critical theory, which was her field, and hired a man. Then, Eve wrote to her brother, they slowly realized that they hadn't replaced her at all. Quote, fond as they are of Andy Parker, the man they hired, they still haven't quite succeeded in replacing Liz, and that Liz's having been a woman and a feminist and over 30 may have had as much to do with her importance to them as her being a critical theorist. So, they wrote a new advertisement that called for expertise in English and women's studies. Nearly every woman that Eve knew applied for it. Word got around that the department was looking, and then word got around that the department was looking for someone not like Bruss, but like Eve. Candidates were asked what they thought about her work, and for Eve, this was very distressing. Quote, everybody was going to be angry at me, whether or not I got the job. And meanwhile, given the sexual politics of her work, she explains, quote, much as Amherst might say they want someone like Eve Sedgwick, obviously the chances of their wanting anyone quite as much like Eve Sedgwick as yours truly seem fairly slim. Right? Or perhaps they want someone even more like Eve Sedgwick than Eve Sedgwick. Right? But she did manage to be just enough, but not too much Eve for them, and they hired her. So reproductive problems abound in that story. Eve is a substitution for Liz Bruss, a replacement sought after the department in her narrative had gotten its first attempt at that substitution wrong by not appreciating the importance of the fact that Bruss was a woman and a feminist. But she's also filling out a space carved out by the idea of Eve Sedgwick, which is not quite the same thing as her actual self. This chain of substitution is anchored in the grave of a woman who died in pregnancy. Bruss's death was, quote, a sickening shock for everyone at Amherst, since Liz was, first of all, a wonderful and smart person, and secondly, very important to the department, even though, as a pioneering woman, this is all from the letter, she'd also had incredible amounts of shit from them. And there are credible older women in other departments who are willing to say that that is what really killed her, end quote. In accepting that job, Eve Sedgwick stepped into the institution's ecology of grief and grievance. When I was hired at the University of California, Riverside, the senior Americanist in my department was Emory Elliott. Emory Elliott moved to my department from Princeton University. That campus's English department had been torn apart by the university's response to a sexual assault case. A graduate student accused a faculty member of rape. The fact that the student and the faculty member were both men, combined with the department's prestige, made this into the academic scandal of the moment. The case was handled so badly that numbers of faculty, like Emory, left the campus in protest. This made national news. When I started at Riverside in 1999, the dust had barely settled on a terrible sexual harassment case in our own history department. In May that year, the Chronicle of Higher Ed published an expose titled, "A History Department Implodes Over Sex Bias and a Suicide." The subheading frames the crisis as one about academic culture, gender, and measuring productivity. A group of men in the department had attempted to fire an assistant professor because she had become pregnant. A handful of graduate students had accused men in the department of propositioning them, and far worse. We work inside wounds. At big, public, under-resourced institutions like mine, we experience our workplace crises on a continuum: ridiculous teaching loads, a lack of instructional support, depressing and rundown classrooms, and gross understaffing yield a near-daily sense of crisis that makes it really hard to do the imaginative, vulnerable-making work of confronting, for example, intractable bullies on your faculty. Academic work is like this. We are compelled to find a wrong to right in our work. Many of us work on subjects that have a direct relationship to who we are and what we've been through. That's the case here. For nearly 15 years, I have been thinking about what happened, about the action of casting N out. We certainly needed a break from her crisis, which engulfed not just me, but my colleagues. But her crisis resonated with deeper problems in our workplace. If I have a desire for justice around my case, it is about those cracks in the foundation. And I think I'm going to stop there. And if you could bring the hot lights up. Yeah. I wanted to leave some time. I was kind of at risk of losing track, so I wanted to stop myself. I was like, that sounds like a conclusion.
Hi. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was, it felt very intimate. Yes. Or also in some points I was like, I felt it. I actually, I have a comment, or I was like while you were speaking, this text of Elsa Dorlac came to my mind. Do you know?
Wait, what came to you?
This book of Elsa Dorlac,
Oh, no.
this self-defense, and this passage where she talks about like this moment of enduring the harassment, and like this like long period of like enduring and hiding and And she also describes this as self-defense. And then also comes this flipping point where we take action and where, like what usually people call maybe the self-defense that comes afterwards. Maybe personal question, how long did it take you to come to this flipping point? Or also what do you think about the other book?
Yeah, I mean, again, I should say, my case, I think one of the things I think is important to say about my case, right, is that it's all workplace centered. And so the injury was really, even though it's affected me personally and in my personal life, and I'd say I've maybe been slower to recover in my personal life than in my work life, but that's not very encouraging because I would say it's taken a really long time. But a big turning point for me was when I was writing this, there's a chapter in which I narrate what happened to me as a stalking victim. And the story around me is so crazy because I only wrote that because there was this man in my department who sexually harassed a lot of graduate students. Or he sexually harassed and bullied a lot of students. And this case came out in 2014. What happened to me in my own case was 2009 to 2011. And then I started writing about this stuff. And then this case happened in my department. And then he fixated on me. And he had this narrative about how he was the real victim, that I was the fake, right? And that my harassment story wasn't true and that he was going to expose me. And he was pitching that story to people like Laura Kipnis and to journalists. And Brian Leiter, who's a troll that works at University of Chicago and writes a thing called the Leiter Report, which is an absolute scandal. You can Google him in my name and you'll see that he more or less threatened to write about my case on that blog, which has a much higher readership than does the Chronicle of Higher Ed, for example. So I was terrified that this was going to come back out and that through this awful space. And so I wrote down what happened to me. All right, I get upset talking about that because that was really hard. Thank you for your question, because sometimes it's good to be reminded that was really crazy and crazy making. And I'm getting emotional because I'm thinking about how much I love human resources, the art space that I'm a part of in Chinatown. Maybe the answer to your question is also something about what artists and the community of artists can offer each other that maybe academics are not so good at. I decided that in 2019 I was going to read that and I was going to treat it like a Spalding Gray style monologue and try to turn it into writing, right, for me. But I couldn't do that without throwing N under the bus, and I didn't want to do that. This is the baby reindeer part, because in that narrative he has an attachment to her and compassion for her. And that's really hard it's really hard. Anyway, so the first time I read it was the first week of January in 2019, and it was a room like this. And I thought I saw her in the room, and and I was I went to a place in my head where I realized she will always be my best reader, she will always be my closest reader. This has been going on for 10 years at that point, right? She wasn't actively stalking me anymore, but just I get a message every now and again. And I realized I have to embrace her as a reader, not just accept her as a reader, but I can't write from this without really, in essence, valuing the experience of it. So for me, that was the first time I wrote that down, right? That this person is a reader, and she's a welcome reader, right? Not that I'm not going to have a defensive relationship to the possibility that this former student would read my writing and that she might also decode it to her own key. That I shouldn't try to control for that. So I'd say that for me was a recovery moment. And you can see I settle down emotionally even as I narrate it, because, I'd say that was, and that's also about working yourself out of the paranoid position, right? The paranoid position be to protect my writing from her presence, right? And to try to imagine a sphere of reading that she isn't in, right? And then I get so focused on her that my energy goes to pushing her out, right? I think that's a real kind of insight for me in recognizing, that yeah, that she's a part of my reading audience, as would be other people who maybe suffer from delusional disorder, right? And in the book, I want there to be room for people who maybe have, suffer from schizoaffective disorder, delusional disorders, or, have been through things like that, where they've kind of seen the world through another interpretive lens, yeah. So thank you for that question. It's really rich. And I've actually never been asked that. Yeah, there's a question over here.
Hi, thank you. You kind of started talking about how you were thinking about some of your audience or your readers. Yeah. And I was, as you were talking and reading from your book, I was kind of wondering who you thought of as your maybe ideal readers, and who reads your work, or how does it, your work is both personal and like a technical. Yeah. And so I was just wondering, like, how you who you think of as your readers, or hope as your readers. Yeah.
Thank you. Also a great question, and it connects directly, right? This book is strange. It has different moods, and in fact, kind of organizing it. That I had this. In the introduction, I talk about this in more depth than I shared with you, right? Because, like the Nassar chapter, I'm really proud of that chapter, but it is like clinical, And I mean, it has a lot of momentum, and it has a real argument to it, and but it's not. I barely write about me in there, except to acknowledge that my attachment to it was about like kind of doing something for a victim, and then also like I do think I think people who've been through an administrative process that's gone awry, like what happened in my case, and what happens pretty much to anyone who engages with these processes, whether they be at school or the criminal justice system. You gain a lot of insight from doing that. So I wanted to kind of convert that. And I think there's a dogged and perverse part of me that was like, I'm gonna take this really shitty thing that happened at school, and I'm gonna put it in my freaking promotion file. And not that anybody who votes on your stuff really reads your work, but like there was some part of me that wanted to like actually like put it like Trojan horse style, like just like what happens if you do this. And so there's I have perverse attachments to like reading scenarios. As is the case with campus sex, campus security, however, like I do, it's like this thing where I know that when I talk about stalking, anyone who has been through anything like it has something, they have insight, and it's an occasion for conversation and mutual recognition, which is very rewarding, and the book definitely means to do that. I think I want people who read my work to want to write or to make work always, even if I'm not writing about art. And a lot of students now feel maybe a little bit more permission than they used to talk about their own experiences of victimization. And I'm hoping to offer what feels like a useful model that gives you room to breathe. I think those are some of my more ambitious desires for it. And then there's also like something about feminism and queer theory for me. I kind of have felt betrayed by queer theory around these issues, which is also, any betrayal narrative is also like this idea of this promise that you think was kind of made to you by it, which is always itself a kind of projection and a fiction, right? But, that I have, certainly when a lot of this stuff was going down, I found voices, very prominent voices in queer theory were really inadequate to talking about sexual harassment in particular. And that kind of surprised me. And so I kind of, I want my book to contribute to work like Sarah Ahmed's and the kind of ongoing conversation thinking about this space. And thinking about it too in a way like where there's weird pleasures, and it's not like, I don't know, I want it to be a literary experience. I want it to have a poetics. And that I'd say is a little different from Ahmed's work, which is beautifully written, but it's written as philosophy and written as feminist critical theory. And I have very intense storytelling modes in this book, which I want people to feel that kind of almost like hard-boiled voice, this kind of voice that you find in a lot of victim literature, like like Chanel Miller's book is a great, probably one of the best survivor texts out there. Yeah, so I kind of want to rhyme and harmonize with those voices too. So.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm curious about because we're talking about, at one point you were talking about a sort of system level and a personal level.
Yeah.
And I'm curious actually about the system, sort of broken system, as a malevolent sort of character in its own right, a source of paranoia at times. Also a traumatizing agent, almost as much as the harasser. And I guess this is my version of a personal question. I've been chairing a department for several years. Is there a latent ethics also in what you're writing? Is there a dream of a system that actually works?
Yeah. Okay. This goes back to all, through my work on harassment. This is part of campus sex, campus security, and if I haven't made it totally clear, I can say here, right, that when things go wrong inside a group or organization, right, that we have this natural response, which is to imagine that you could write the system better. And that in and of itself, that is actually the paranoid relationship to the crisis, right? And so having a non-defensive relationship to the fact that there is a crisis would be the ethical position, right? Which is something like, there's of course like holding oneself accountable to the conditions of possibility that allow that kind of thing to flourish. Like were there things that you missed and you didn't speak out and that kind of thing. That's more productive than, for me, the idealized, this idea of a system where none of these things would happen, right? That poem is perfect, right? Because we hurt each other, right? And we are hurt by others. And it's sort of like, it's like that kind of like suffering is a condition of living. It is kind of like a part of that. So for me, that is a kind of an ethics. There's a part I didn't read in the book in which I riff on that line that the institution will never love you back, which is kind of wielded not necessarily with malice, but it is a socially supported, endorsed form of cynicism that leaves those of us who maybe feel hurt and betrayed by workplace scenarios feeling like we've been foolish to imagine that it wouldn't be that way. Right? And like an institution it's a system that doesn't exist on its own. It is only in existence as it is practiced by a group of people, right? It's not that if the institution doesn't love you back, it's because you're in a workplace that has normalized the idea that we don't love our colleagues and that we can't love our students and that we can't love each other in our work and that maybe you love the work but you hate the job and the institution and so you're a fool for loving the school where you work and it's ridiculous to even try, right? So that's kind of where the book lands, is on all of that. And I say that right now as an employee of the University of California, right? The University of California, where we are toggling back and forth between, oh my God, this is like, a weapons manufacturing system. Like that's basically what it's, but at the same time, like I couldn't love our students more, right? And I couldn't love our students more as they are struggling to figure out what to do, or my colleagues more as we are working together and sometimes not working together and sometimes debating and keeping each other up at night with arguments about how can we best be present to the struggle that our students are leading towards divestment. Like in this moment, we are living like really close to that relationship of that sense of betrayal, but also that love, right, and that sense of another possibility, right? So. Yeah, anyway, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was like so inspiring. And I had to think about like two things that crossed like my path in the last weeks. Like one work by Rebecca Horn, like you spoke about that object separation with love and hate, and like Rebecca Horn has that one work with the knives. I don't know if you know it. Like it's like a machine with knives, like going like this, and like on the one set there's the word love, on the other set there's the word hate, and they cross each other like all the time. And when I saw it, I recently had to think about like Britney Spears doing that knife dance on Instagram where she was like super harassed afterwards, and I also like had to think about why you were talking about like being a public figure and like having that distinction between public and private in that institution, and holding that frame, which just doesn't work in that institution. Like if we like really go into teaching, it never works, and if we really go into art, it also like that distinction just
Mean public-private?
that blurs so much, and that has so much like capacity for abuse or also for harassment. But also, like, if we just, I ask myself so much, like, how to shift this distinction in something else, which would, like, open a room of, like, committing in other spheres or something like that.
I love that question. We're going to talk about this in the seminar tomorrow. Because, like, on the one hand, right, there's the public-private and the way in which that line gets weaponized, right, and it's a site of enormous political struggle. Right? And so we can think about privacy, for example, as a bourgeois privilege, and a privilege to which people do not have equal access. Right? It's also important to remember, right, that a sense of privacy is absolutely integral to the formation of a self, right, and that sense of a boundary between the self and the other. Right, it's very fundamental, and one of the gifts, right, that the experience that I went through gave me was it drove me to like read writing about people who are suffering from like psychotic breaks and schizophrenia, and I recommend Christopher Bolas's book When the Sun Burst. That's a really inspiring book, and I think it might be something that's interesting to makers, because there are things that are happening in a person's relationship of like inside and outside that are really quite profound and are really different. And for many, many decades, people who were living with these kinds of relationships to self and world were just dismissed as untreatable and were put in asylums forever, right? And you know, Freud didn't think that people suffering from paranoia and paranoid delusions, for example, were treatable. And Freud thought that all paranoids were also like homosexuals. So homosexuals are like paranoids and also psychotic. Trans people are just also seen by the same psychoanalytic apparatus as psychotic and untreatable. And so, you know, like there's a really awful history of unending incarceration that wraps itself around the pathologization of queer folks. So anyway, it's like rich and loaded territory, and in the middle of that is a sense of public and private. And so the paranoid chapter actually has a whole like section on photography and paranoia and privacy. The right to privacy, as it's not a constitutional right in the United States. It's a right that is established in a legal, or it's like the discourse on it is kind of codified in a legal essay by Brandeis and Warren from the late 19th century, and it's called The Right to Privacy, the name of this essay. It actually pivots on stories about detective cameras. So like, you know, the last decades of the 19th century, cameras started to get really small, and there was like, in essence, you could buy hidden cameras, and people could wear like cameras that were disguised as like pocket watches and things like that. And then you had a broad social anxiety about the surveillance, right? And people secretly photographing each other. And I can't remember which one of these two white men who wrote this essay had a society wife, and she was often like, she and her friends were like, ooh, the stars are just like us. They were being subject to the 19th century version of that kind of photography. And embedded in that essay are references to these cases of like, some of them are, you know, whatever, but like they're cases that are like, you know, the police are in like a man's apartment and the wall is covered with photographs of women who've been photographed unknowingly when they were having sex, right? So like, it's actually, and then like there's a lot in there where you're seeing what actually today we would describe as revenge porn, as actually what they're, you know, this is like a passing note in that essay, but like what we call revenge porn actually goes all the way back to basically the invention of the small camera and the anxiety around protecting that sense of the sacred and the private, which is very much wrapped up in protecting privileged white women's sense of privacy. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on about that. But like, there's so many ways in which like I got so like obsessed with this. You know, like I got obsessed with this because when Tyler Clementi, the Rutgers student, committed suicide, right? Who committed suicide, now I want to say 2011, he was being secretly photographed by his roommate during a hookup. And he found out about it. So Tyler Clementi had just, like, he was a freshman, and he was gay, just moved out of his family home. I think he'd been at Rutgers for just like a month or two. And then he didn't know, like, all he knew is that his roommate was secretly recording this hookup. He didn't know what the roommate saw, how long the recording was, or anything. He went to Rutgers and he asked to be moved to a different room. He didn't want to be in the same room. And they basically sent him down some kind of administrative rabbit hole, right? Like, this is something I don't think would happen now. I think colleges like now understand, you know, when you have a crisis like that, you remove the student from the room. You know, you can put him in a hotel room. You know, like, you acknowledge that's a crisis. That sounds awful, right? And you know, and just I think it was like 3 days after he reported it, he committed suicide. When I found out that she was recording me, and it was like I knew there was a video recording, and I knew there was an audio recording, and the school wouldn't tell me anymore, and so I didn't know where, how long, whether that was at home, at work. I went through almost 2 weeks of that. I was nearly catatonic. I was really like, I was so undone by it, it shocked me, right? You know, I was in my 40s when this happened, and I thought about Tyler Clementi. You know, I thought about like how undone I was, because in essence, my sense of privacy didn't disappear, but it was really threatened, and it made me, it was like the cage of the self had been rattled, you know? And as you read about like these kinds of really profound psychic crises and delusions and things like that, you start to see there's like there's like a kind of a story there about the self as a container, and that sense of like the container having, like, leaking out, right? Or you've become transparent as glass, right? And everybody can see what you're thinking and feel what you're thinking, right? So I think when we're thinking about like the public and the private, it's very important, right? Even as we may critique a sense of privacy, right, as something that looks like a form of entitlement, is to also recognize that it's a form of entitlement that every human, it's like a part of the sense of human dignity, right, is in that. Yeah, so thank you for that question. Let me talk about a part of the book that's really important to me. It's a really interesting body of literature around that whole concept and its relationship to 19th century photography. So, yeah.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you so much. I think this is such raw and provocative, but also deeply theorized and intellectually engaging work for us to think about as a community, about what it means to be a community, what it means to hurt and to heal, and what it means to come together under, you know, institutional auspices that might or might not aid that hurt or that healing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, you mentioned it, but a little bit more about your work with human resources and the way that you found these other forms of community that might be a model for us to think about as well.
Yeah, thank you. So Human Resources is a nonprofit. Sorry, I'm as board president, I'm very at risk of slipping into the language that we have on file for how we talk about the organization, right? So it's an interdisciplinary art space in an old Kung Fu movie theater in Chinatown. And it's been around since 2010 and in its location since 2012. It's, until recently, it was almost entirely volunteer, which is a big deal, right? As you all know, working in the arts, right? The name human resources. So I came on in 2012, 2 years after it had been founded. It was founded by, I can't remember if it's 5 or 6 people, a couple of whom, I mean, they all had some kind of direct relationship to the arts, either as artists or musicians, or as people who were invested in like making spaces and all that. So, but a few of them have pretty intense corporate jobs. Eric Kim, his family owns acute care psychiatric hospitals, and that's his day job, is working as an executive in that context. Giles Miller is an investigator and has his own investigations company, and he's the one who told me about that email, kind of like certified mail thing. He's also the one who taught me there are a lot of things that you can never know, and you shouldn't fixate on that, and you just have to accept that you won't ever have the answer. And like that was really deep. Kathleen Kim, Eric's sister, is a human rights lawyer who specializes in human trafficking. She's also a musician and a member of the group LA Fog. So the name, which was actually, I learned recently, suggested by the artist Dean Erdman in a phone call. To me, the name speaks on two different things, which is that human resources, which is actually organizationally lightly modeled after John Zorn's Space the Stone. Insofar as it's like this group of folks, we run the calendar by working as hosts, partners, and so you just need one person who commits to hosting an event to make an event happen. An event really everything is really dependent upon the energy that the individuals who are part of human resources bring to things, right? So human resources partly describes like the resources that are humans, and it also partly describes the experience that some of us behind it have with very large institutions, which makes us really appreciate what can be done by a group of people who maintain the lowest kind of institutional profile possible, right? So we're not anti-institution, right? It's just that we try not to have a brand, right? We try not to think about our legacy, right? We try to just keep it going by maintaining a relatively stable structure. But it's also we're also hovering at a very low, small scale, and that was partly in response to people's more experienced arts administrators in our community had talked to us about the pressure that funding and foundation organizations, they kind of pressure you inevitably to scale up, as does capitalism. So we've definitely scaled up. We just started payroll this month, right? We went from a stipend position for our managing director to payroll this month. We've been scaling up extremely slowly and carefully, right? And it's partly out of a commitment to trying to maintain that sense of the human connection and human resources. That's one way I understand it. It's been a really important alternative space for me to express myself at a time when I was dealing with so much weird stuff at work. I stopped teaching visual culture pretty much. I teach courses that are centered on sports, but I used to teach queer visual culture. I used to teach really sexually explicit material. I used to teach to the 3 to 5 really queer kids in the class who needed that class, and then let everybody else kind of draft along that energy. And I totally stopped doing that at work because I didn't feel, I just couldn't, I couldn't metabolize even what had happened to me because it happened a lot around my teaching, and I didn't trust the institution, and it didn't happen at once. But that withdrawal happened pretty over many years, and it took me a long time to even notice that had happened. It was really finishing this book, and I've been responding to that by moving back into that space. I'm cooperating faculty in the art department, for example. I'm really trying to bring that part of me back to Riverside. The thing is that it wouldn't exist at all if it wasn't for human resources. It wouldn't be there at all if it wasn't for that. I don't know where I would be. Right, it's the place where, I haven't been writing about art so much, but I've never been so deeply involved in the arts as I have been in the past 12 years. So, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know if that's very, that's. It's a great space, and if you're ever in LA, check us out. There's always something going on. We had blood rain down from the ceiling last week. I was so proud of that. For Leche de Virgin, an artist in Mexico, performance artist, high recommend. I don't think they performed in Chicago. Yeah. There's a microphone.
Is that fetus?
Yeah.
The fetus live of the 8-month-old pregnancy?
No. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. Yeah. It was a really absolutely awful story. And it was important to Eve. When I saw it in that letter, I remembered that I'd heard it from her herself, that this was one of the stories that she told of her own academic formation. I'll tell you another piece of tea, which I don't think Hal would mind my sharing. I met up with her husband, Hal, after I went to the archive. I've been thinking a lot about Eve, and I think I have another essay in me that's about all this stuff, but it's about her poetry. And when I told people I was going to look at Eve's archive, a lot of times, it was very common, people would ask me, what do you think Eve would think about me too? And a lot of my writing is partly a response to that. She actually wrote quite a bit about sexual harassment. And I was talking to Hal about that, and we're like on a walk, we're walking around Washington Square Park. And then he told me, and he's kind of like a quieter person, and he's like, Eve wrote her own pornography. And I was just like, oh, of course she did, right? I was just like, can you imagine? I was like, can you imagine writing your own pornography? And he said that actually, as she got notorious and as she became a public figure, she asked him to destroy it. And so he destroyed it for her. Wow. Yeah, so that was like, wow. But I was like lost in thought, like, can you imagine writing your own pornography? And then I remembered, like, half our students are writing fanfic. That's pretty much what they're doing, right? So, it's one of those moments when, it's like, because we've been so indoctrinated, maybe, right, by certain levels of discourse about sexual culture and the kids these days, right? Into thinking that our kids are not having sex and they're uptight and whatever, I don't know. And, and I was like, digesting this thing. Can you imagine? Eve wrote her own pornography. That luxury I can't afford, right? But it was literary skills I don't have. I want someone to write that for me, right? Like, it's like, anyway, I started to reject myself into that whole scene. But then I was like remembering that, like the discovery, I taught a writing seminar with English majors last year, realizing that like my students who hated writing and really struggled with academic writing, many of them had really robust writing practices. And many of those writing practices were really filthy. And staged around like the games that they're involved, their D&D games and like all kinds of like, it was fanfic about everything, right? It's not that every student in your classroom is writing fanfic, but it was like a reminder to me too. It's just like when you start to let those ideas kind of settle, right, about who your students are, why would they tell you, right, if you're the teacher, right? It might be the last person they would let you see that side of themselves. Anyway, but still, I'm convinced that the pornography lives on in the form of a just really outrageous poem that she wrote that's called Lost Letter. And you can find that in a collection of her poems. I think it's called Bathroom Songs. And that's free and available online. So, yeah. Is that a good part to end when we start talking about fanfic and?
I think that's an excellent point. Let me check. Are there any final questions for Jennifer?
Obviously, I could talk for hours about this. So, yeah. See, I'm just starting to relax now. So.
Any final questions? Anyone wants to get a last one in?
And the topic for tomorrow in that seminar is this short essay by Sigmund Freud, A Case of Paranoia Running Counter to the Theory. And it's something that I write about a lot in the book, and I'm really excited to talk about that with folks. And this Didier Onzieux essay on the formal signifier and the psychic envelope. And if anyone wants that, I'm happy to send PDFs. That stuff is real. I think that stuff is gold if you're a maker, because it's all about the forms of the self. I'll leave the audience with just like this bit, a tidbit from Anzio, which I think is really helpful for artists. The psychic envelope refers to the sense of self that's attached to every sense. So there's a different one for smell, for touch, for taste, right? So for every single sense, there's kind of a sense of a psychic container, right? That's specific and is manifested, learned through sense. You can come into your sense of self, of course, by sensing the world. Right? So anyway, I think it's fascinating because I think it can be really powerful to dial into that when you're making, what is sound doing, right, on that level, right? I think when you're moving into that space, which a couple of the people I talked to today, I think are, you're really going somewhere special. Anyway.
Well, thank you so much. Low-res students, you can find these readings on Canvas. Please read these readings for tomorrow, as you all know. And please join me in a huge round of applause for Jennifer Doyle. Thank you so much. And I will see you all tomorrow.
School is in session.